everybody to participate. We're just not going to get it with the foul schemes that are being proposed. And so, Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, may I ask that the pending quorum call be vitiated?
Without objection.
May I ask that at the conclusion, I'm about to yield the floor to my distinguished senior senator, Jack Reed. May I ask unanimous consent that at the conclusion of his remarks, I be granted recognition?
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, Senator Whitehouse and I have come to the floor today to pay tribute to Governor Bruce Sondland. Governor Sondland passed away last Thursday. He was an extraordinary gentleman, and I think it's particularly appropriate that my colleague be here along with me because he was the director of policy for Governor Sondland, and many of the achievements of the Sondland administration were direct contributions of Senator Whitehouse's extraordinary efforts. But today I am here first as a Rhode Islander to say on behalf of the people of my state how much we appreciate the leadership, the vision, the determination of Governor Bruce Sondland. He was elected in the midst of the worst financial crisis in the history of our state since the Great Depression, a collapse of a private credit union system. He got through that crisis as only he could. Then he went on to reconstruct our airport, to reform our workers' compensation system, to make lasting contributions to the people of Rhode Island. And so, as a Rhode Islander, I come here to salute an extraordinary governor. I also come here as a colleague in government. When Governor Sondland was elected to the State House in 1990, I was elected to my first term in the United States Congress. And so I was there to observe the extraordinary intellect, the extraordinary determination, the skill, and the relentless commitment to doing his best to help the people of Rhode Island. I saw it at first hand. Truly, without Bruce's leadership, we would not have weathered the financial crisis of 1991 in Rhode Island. His extraordinary grasp of the financial details, his unwavering determination to do the right thing, not the popular thing, his ability to withstand withering criticism from all quarters, resulted not only in the restitution of the savings of hundreds of thousands of Rhode Islanders, but essentially the repayment of the monies that had to be borrowed to take care of the crisis. It was an extraordinary work, and frankly, I think everyone in Rhode Island rapidly conceded that only Bruce Sondland could have done it. I also come here as like Bruce, a veteran of our armed forces, but unlike Bruce, not a combat veteran. Bruce Sondland joined the United States Army and qualified as a pilot in the Air Corps in World War II. He was brave. He was tough. He led with great distinction his crew in numerous bombing raids over occupied Europe. In one of those raids, he was shot down. And of course, he had the presence of mind to keep the aircraft as steady as he could, to let as many of his crewmen escape. And finally, at the very last moment, he himself parachuted to Earth. He was behind enemy lines. He was without any weapons except his determination, his courage, and his determination, again, not only to survive, but to return to the fight. Through an amazing series of breathtaking episodes that read like a novel, he would go from village to village. He'd seek out the priests in the French village, or Belgian village. He'd say in his fluent French, as a graduate of Williams College, he was an American flyer, he needed their help. And he always received the help. And then he would be given assistance, be hid for a while. And then he would go, he told me, with his great sort of sardonic smile, that he would find unusual ways to get around. He would go into the village at market time, when the ladies of the village had parked their bicycles, and he'd take one. And he'd pedal as fast as he could to the next village, where he'd find another bicycle, and he'd pedal. And so he covered the route through occupied Europe, finally making his way into Switzerland. A remarkable bit of courage. After the war, he continued to distinguish himself in business and in so many other different ways. But one thing he left, a legacy not just to the people of Rhode Island, not just a public record in Rhode Island, but he was part of that greatest generation that left an indelible image on the soldiers, the sailors, the aviators, the Marines who serve today, of fidelity to duty, of courage, of determination to serve and to sacrifice on behalf of your comrades and your country. And that image continues to sustain our forces in the field and this great nation. So to Governor Sondland, to his family, as a Rhode Islander, I thank you. As a colleague in government, I thank you. And as someone who was inspired by your service to serve this country, I thank you. May you rest in peace. And I will yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I'm very pleased to follow Rhode Island's distinguished senior senator with remarks about our friend and our former governor, Bruce Sondland. He served with some of our colleagues in the Senate today when Ben Nelson was governor and when Tom Carper was governor of Nebraska and Delaware, respectively. They served with Bruce, and he was one of those irrepressible characters who they remember very distinctly to this day. He had a remarkable Rhode Island life. He was the son of a jewelry store owner who in turn was the son of an immigrant watchmaker. And it turns out he had real athletic talent. He was a track star, breaking record after record around Rhode Island. It was as a competitor in that era that he first felt the sting of discrimination over being Jewish, and that gave him a lasting characteristic to stick up for the underdog. As I mentioned at his funeral service, he was the opposite of a fair weather friend. He became a better friend the stormier the weather got around you. He went on with his great generation to defend our country and to fight for freedom around the globe in World War II. He was the pilot of a B-17, the Damn Yankee, at a time when the life expectancy for bomber crews over Europe was not very long. And unfortunately, his aircraft was shot down and crashed in Belgium. He was able to survive the crash, although as the pilot, he was the last person out, the last living person out. And when he went back to Belgium years later, people who remembered that day remembered being astonished that the parachute that he had appeared out of no place just above the ground, just before he hit, just in time to save him. But he was injured and hid in the manner of the purloined letter. He hid in plain sight as troops swept the area looking for the survivors of the bomber crash. He lay out in the middle of the field in a deep place in the plowed furrow where you could really only see him if you got down to the end of the furrow and looked. And so as the Nazi soldiers were poking through the hay bales and prowling through the sheds and looking under whatever they could find, there he lay, more or less in plain sight, but still. He was shot down on December 1st of 1943, so you can imagine how cold it was lying in that field while the search went on around you for hours in Belgium. And for the rest of his life, he hated the cold. There was no weather that was too warm for him, and he hated the cold. I remember when First Lady Hillary Clinton came to speak at an event in Rhode Island when he was governor, he was wearing this enormous black sheepskin coat, very thick and very warm, as he prepared to step outside of the State House and go out on the stone deck looking over downtown on a cold, cold winter afternoon. And Mrs. Clinton started needling him about how Jack Kennedy didn't need a coat and, you know, it's really not very fashionable and people are going to question how tough you are if you go out there and have this big coat on. And she needled him enough that he ended up handing off the coat, went outside into the bitter cold, made the introduction of the First Lady, turned to welcome her to the podium, and out she came with a smile ear to ear, wearing his coat. And he loved that kind of exchange with people, and I think immensely loved the Clintons. He was one of the first governors, if not the first governor, to endorse President Clinton, and the Clintons never forgot. He did not get to Switzerland until May 5th of 1944. He was 156 days as an American Jewish bomber pilot behind Nazi lines in Belgium and in France. No greater testament to this man's resourcefulness and drive could be imagined than succeeding for that long in that circumstance. When he came back from the war, he went to Harvard Law School and became an attorney at the Department of Justice. He was an assistant to a Rhode Island Attorney General, a Rhode Islander who became Attorney General, J. Howard McGrath, and it began a very, very successful career in the law for him. It was also the time when President Kennedy came to office, representing that greatest generation, then a new generation, and he trusted Bruce Sunderland to run his inaugural parade, which was the kind of logistics feat that Governor Sunderland loved. The fact that it snowed like crazy the night before did not faze him a bit. The entire parade went off on schedule and without incident as planned, despite the very inclement weather, because Bruce had prepared so well in advance. President Kennedy appointed him to the board of ComSat, and for many years he was the longest-serving director of ComSat, which is a brilliant public-private partnership that helped open up the skies to the space age. His business career was remarkable. He took a foundering airline called Executive Jet and turned it into the largest private and charter airline in the country. He took a department store in downtown urban Providence at a time when New England cities were in decline, in a time when cities across the country were losing ground to the suburbs that were sprouting up around them. He took this, I don't know, dying business, I guess you'd say, and he saw in that downtown department store a media empire. And he went off and he began buying radio stations and TV stations and created this remarkable company, the Outlet Corporation, as a media empire. He also turned it into a refuge from time to time. In the blizzard of 1978, the state of Rhode Island was clobbered by snow. People were trapped downtown for hours and hours, in some cases days. He saw to it that the outlet company opened, that the cafeteria in it kept serving, that the part of the department store that sold clothing gave clothing whoever needed it, that the part of the store that sold bedding was spread all over the store so people could sleep on the bedding. He loved a crisis. He responded to a crisis better than anybody I know. It brought out his best characteristics. And they were certainly necessary when he was elected governor, because on the very first day of his administration, he was obliged to close more than 30 different lending institutions across Rhode Island, serving more than 300,000 of Rhode Island's 1 million population. He went from being sworn in to the receiving line, where he greeted all his happy supporters and all the welcoming officials and all the well-wishers who came from Rhode Island, and rolled immediately from that into a press conference in which he announced that we had to close these institutions because the deposit insurance provider ended up having been crooked and had failed, and they could not operate without deposit insurance, and so they had to be closed. That was a heck of a way to start a governorship. He also found out that he had inherited the biggest budget deficit that the state had ever seen, and we could never find a state with a bigger percentage deficit than Governor Sondland inherited. And if that weren't enough, the workers' compensation system melted down, and every workers' compensation insurer said, I'm leaving the state, I can't take it. A lesser person might have failed under all that pressure. Not only did Bruce meet all of those exigencies of the moment, he also worked very hard to set a better ethical tone and to restructure state government so that it would be lasting, because most of those things went wrong because of failures in ethics in the Rhode Island state government. So that was a pretty remarkable added accomplishment on top of solving all those underlying problems. And third was he had confidence in Rhode Island, and he had confidence in America, and we were in a terrible recession, and so he went to work and he got things done. He built a new airport terminal. He got a new mall started that would be built. He built a new hotel that allowed for the convention center to go forward, so he built a new convention center. He changed the skyline of Providence. He moved one of our universities to a downtown campus, and he understood that in times of economic distress, activity was good. And positive activity that brought jobs was better still. In his personal characteristics, he was a remarkable individual. He was relentless and determined and decisive when issues were presented before him. With his staff, he was demanding and abrupt and terse. I asked him once why he didn't bother to say hello when you got a phone call from him. He just started talking at you. And why, when the conversation was over, he just hung up without saying goodbye or any pleasantries. And I said, don't you think you would go a little further if you said hello and goodbye in your telephone conversations? He said, how much time do you think I'd waste in my entire life? Add up all the times you've wasted saying hello and goodbye. Doesn't do anything that's productive. He had that kind of an attitude. But he was bold, and he was willing to take big, big leaps. I guess back to his early days as a broad jumper, he was willing to take big, big leaps. As a staff person, he was extraordinary to work for. I've told the story of opening day. A few of us were in on that news, but it had to be very closely held because you'd have created a run on all those banks if word had leaked. So even many of his staff people had no idea this was going on until he announced it. So that was kind of a shocker, and made it for an interesting time to be a staff person. On another occasion, he had a couple of raccoons bothering on his property, and they were bothering a den of baby foxes. And he didn't want the baby foxes to be killed by the raccoons, so he took out a shotgun, went down to the end of his property, and shot the two raccoons. And then climbed in the car with his state trooper and headed off to work, and of course described this exciting episode of his morning. And the trooper said to him, Governor, don't you realize that it's against the law to fire off a weapon in the city of Newport? And he's, in his customary brusque and decisive way, said, well, take me to the courthouse. A trial was going on in the Newport County Courthouse, and into the trial walks the governor. And the governor interrupts the trial and tells the judge, I would like to plead guilty. And the judge thankfully said, well, I'm not going to accept your plea. I'm doing something else right now. Plus, you don't have benefit of counsel. To which he tartly responded, I'm as good a lawyer as there is in Rhode Island. And the judge responded, well, a lawyer who is representing himself has a fool for a client. And on your client's behalf, let me tell you that I'm not going to accept that plea. So there's the governor's staff. The phone rings, and the message is, your boss is in court trying to plead guilty to a criminal offense. You can imagine how that lights up a staff's day. So down we went to try to help take care of that. Another day was the arrival of his daughter. When he was elected, Governor Sondland had 3 sons, Tracy, Stuart, and Peter. Well, it turned out that there was also a daughter. And in midterm, at age 16, Kara arrived and was recognized as Bruce's daughter from a relationship that he had had years before, and taken into the family. And she is now, to the end of his days, was as beloved as any of his sons. But that also can be an exciting day for staff members when suddenly the boss turns up with a brand new 16-year-old daughter that nobody knew about before. He had 5 wives in addition to those 4 children. He led a rich, full, exciting, passionate life, and I miss him very, very much. He died on Thursday. He died very peacefully with his family around him. He was 91 years old. I think he probably put about 151 years of living into those 91 years. And he left a family that loved him, a state that he had served incredibly well, and staff members who really had their lives changed by their exposure to this remarkable, hard-driving, affectionate, bold man. Here we are in Washington as I close, and we're in a situation in which one party is holding the economic future of the country hostage in order to force changes that the American public doesn't want, wouldn't vote for, wouldn't accept if they were consulted. But by virtue of having, in effect, a gun to the head of the economy, they want to force these things, like killing off the Medicare program. Americans are wildly opposed to that in huge, huge numbers. When they found out that that was in the House Republican budget, they rejected it by 4-to-1 margins. And the response to that was to bring back something called cap, cut, and balance, which had hidden beneath the slogan an even worse cut to Medicare. They didn't learn from the lesson that the public didn't want this. They insisted on doing even worse, and doing it by holding the economy hostage. That is the kind of thing that Governor Sondland would not accept. He was first and foremost a patriot, and as hard as he worked and as much as he challenged everyone around him, he always had the purpose of making America better, making America stronger, making Rhode Island better, making Rhode Island stronger, and building towards the future. He had incredible confidence. The notion of holding an economy hostage and threatening the well-being of people to force down their throat something they don't want would be completely alien to his patriotic character. And it makes me miss him a lot as we're trapped in this today. The other party appears to be in large part acquiescing to this, and Governor Sondland's streak of willfulness and determination to do the right thing, I think, is missed on the other side of the aisle as much as his patriotism and desire to put the well-being of people first is missed on the first. So he's a man whose life and accomplishments made a great difference in Rhode Island and have great relevance and resonance even as we stand here today. As I said, I miss him very much. He was very important to me, and I wish we had his forceful, patriotic, buoyant, and determined spirit with us today. I thank the presiding officer, and I yield the floor. And I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Kaka.
Senator from Rhode Island,
Mr. President, may I ask that the quorum call be vitiated?
without objection.
Mr. President, I mentioned my remarks in the speech that I gave on behalf of Governor Sondland that I had delivered at his funeral service, and I would like to ask unanimous consent that my remarks at his funeral service be added at the end of my spoken remarks here on the floor as an addition to the record by unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Yield the floor. Note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka?
President, there are currently two bills headed for a vote to raise the debt ceiling and to reduce spending. One of those two bills from the House Speaker Boehner cuts about $1 trillion in spending and raises the debt ceiling by $1 trillion until the end of the year, approximately. That's about how long it would take to run up another $1 trillion in debt. The other bill from Senate Majority Leader Reid cuts about $1 trillion and raises the debt ceiling about $3 trillion, or past the 2012 election. This is because the President said emphatically just a few days ago at a press conference, quote, "The only bottom line I have is that we have to extend this debt ceiling through the next election into 2013, close quote. So in a sense, it's really quite simple. Speaker Boehner's bill lives up to the principle that I thought we'd all agreed to, that every dollar in debt ceiling increase should be tied to a dollar reduction in spending. The spenders get an advantage since the spending reductions occur over 10 years, whereas the debt ceiling increase would be immediate. But that's the kind of the principle we've been operating on. Senator Reid's bill is a hoax. It uses Washington gimmicks designed to make it look 3 times as large as it is. In reality, it hikes the debt ceiling $3 for every $1 in spending cuts over 10 years. The House bill is 1-to-1, the Senate bill 3-to-1. We have demonstrated this exhaustively in a Budget Committee analysis. I don't think people would dispute it. The House approach, one of the primary way this is accomplished is to count the reduction in spending over the war in Iraq and Afghanistan that's projected to occur and it's already been projected to occur, and count that as a spending cut. Speaker Boehner didn't do that. His would look $1 trillion better also if he used those numbers. The House approach is honest, it's straightforward, and achieves $1 in cuts for every $1 in debt ceiling increase. It allows us to return to the table in a few months to assess our progress, see what's happening in the economy, and begin working toward the greater cuts that are needed. Senator Reid's bill relies on accounting tricks, takes the debt limit off the table until after the election, and exchanges a record $3 trillion in debt hike for only 1/3 as much in debt cuts. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle signed a letter vowing to defeat the Boehner plan. I find this a little shocking, frankly, and surprising. Is it the position of the Senate Democratic majority that $1 trillion in cuts over 10 years is all we need to achieve between now and 2013? Is it their view that $1 in cuts for every $1 in debt limit increase is too steep? Or is it a political effort to protect the President by pushing the debt limit ceiling past the next election, creating the highest increase in debt ceiling, I think, in history, except for perhaps the one the super Democratic majority in the Senate slipped through during the passage of the health care bill? And is it this election issue that Democrats would turn down an agreement on and put us in risk of financial disruption of our economy? So let's step back for a moment and look at the wider context. Washington is often consumed by political fights and blame games. It can be hard to differentiate between facts and talking points, but I'd like to provide as honest an assessment as I can as to why we find ourselves in this unfortunate situation at the 11th hour. process, statutory legal process, to arrive at a budget deal every single year. It's written into the law of the United States. The President is required to submit a budget by law each year, and each chamber is required to pass one separately and then agree on one together. If the year had begun with a serious budget proposal from the President, we wouldn't be in this mess today. But he submitted a budget that would double our debt in 10 years, while he claimed it would not add to the debt. And he claimed it would cause us to live within our means. Indeed, he had a substantial tax increase, a very real tax increase and of significant amounts, but his spending increased even more than that. So that the net total of the President's budget was to make the debt trajectory we're on not better but worse, even with the tax increase. Indeed, his budget next year that he submitted proposed a 10% increase for the Education Department, the Energy Department, the State Department, and even more for the Transportation Department. Those double-digit increases at a time we're running the biggest deficits the nation has ever sustained. Senate Democrats have refused to pass. Meanwhile, in this body, even pass or bring up a budget in 820 days, 2 years. The majority leader said it would be foolish to pass a budget. Foolish to not pass a budget? So these are facts. Our colleagues that run the Senate here have defied the law and sound policy all year long, and now we're paying the price, a last-minute, take-it-or-leave-it panic vote. Nobody yet knows what's going to be in the legislation, and finally, because of the rejection of any bill that seems to be out there at this time. If the White House or Senate Democrats had taken the budget process seriously last year, if they had presented a single credible plan to cut spending, we wouldn't be here at this 11th hour. Indeed, our Democratic colleagues have insisted on secret meetings that shielded them from making any of their budget plans public. That shielded them from any real votes on spending and debt, and those meetings have failed, it appears. Democrats have campaigned and sought control and a majority in the Senate, and they chose, in this time of fiscal crisis, not to engage in the budget process in a serious way. In fact, they are apparently so determined to avoid the public budget process that the Reid bill even includes language designed to circumvent the process for 2 more years. So you'll forgive me if I'm a little concerned by all these attacks on the Tea Party. They didn't start this fire, they sounded the alarm. Before the last election, when Democrats controlled both chambers of Congress by substantial majorities, every conversation was about increasing spending. More, more, more. Congress passed a stimulus bill, the largest single one-time expenditure ever passed by any Congress or any nation in history. Every penny of that borrowed. We were already hugely in debt. We're borrowing now 40 cents of every dollar. It passed. The Congress also passed the President's massive new health care entitlement. It passed the President's request for extraordinary increases in discretionary spending. Non-defense discretionary spending has gone up 24% in a time of record deficits in the last 2 years. We've added $4 trillion to our gross debt since the President took office. Just in the time since the Senate Democrats last passed a budget, we've spent more than $7 trillion without a budget. These are the facts, but after the 2010 election and the emergence of the Tea Party and common sense American people who knew better about what's going on in Washington, we have finally begun to look at Washington's spending problem. Now, instead of just raising the debt ceiling with no spending cuts, as the White House initially and repeatedly demanded, we're talking about how to cut some spending. People in the Tea Party and those who share their concerns should not be the ones vilified. They're good, decent, patriotic Americans whose only crime is rightly fearing for the future of their nation. Are they wrong to be concerned when this Congress spends money willy-nilly every day, 40 cents of it is borrowed? They know this is not right, and that's the kind of message they've sent to us. We need to listen to it. It's the heart of America speaking. The last point I'd like to make is about the issue of compromise. There's been suggestions that the Republicans have simply been unwilling to budge from their position. But the Boehner proposal represents only a small portion of the cuts the Republicans have advocated and that they believe should be achieved. So this is truly a critical point and one the White House will not acknowledge. The House budget that they passed, a long-term 10-year budget that would change the debt trajectory of America and put us on a sound financial course in a responsible way, cuts $6 trillion in comparison to the President's request. The Toomey budget that the Senate voted on cuts about $8 trillion. The House passed a plan which I co-sponsored that not only cuts and caps spending, but that requires the passage of a constitutional balanced budget amendment. In fact, all 47 Republican senators have co-sponsored a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. The $1 trillion in cuts that Speaker Boehner is asking for would be indeed a modest first step, an effort to compromise and reach a number that has had a realistic chance of passing this body. But under his plan, we'll return to the table after that $1 trillion in increase in debt ceiling has been used up. And this is far from the level of savings I would like to see or the Republican House would like to see. $1 trillion is a bitter pill for a lot of those members who know that's not enough. The economists and others, the bondholders, are telling us we need at least $4 trillion. And that just reduces the crisis nature we're in. That would not come close to putting us on a path to a balanced budget over 10 years. Reducing deficits by $4 trillion over 10 years when our deficits are going to increase by $9 to $13 trillion over 10 years obviously does not solve our debt crisis. But $1 trillion is even much smaller. That was a figure that was believed that this Senate might accept. So the House members, in order to avoid a debt crisis and a financial crisis over the debt ceiling, is apparently working hard, and maybe they'll send it over here. I don't know. They're working hard to try to do that. I think that's a reasonable compromise and a fair approach to this Congress. So we're going to spend around $45 trillion over the next 10 years. And that will add as much as $13 trillion to the gross debt. It's clear that we have a lot more work to do. We're going to be fighting for cuts in spending bills, omnibus bills, continuing resolutions, and in every other place we can to impose fiscal discipline on this country. We must control spending. We must control and conquer the debt. The President says he wants a balanced approach to the deficit, a balanced approach, a balanced approach. But a balance is not a tax hike that bails out the big spenders who surged our spending with stimulus bills and surging 24% increases in discretionary spending. going to bail them out by raising taxes, we should never have run up that kind of spending. But balance is not a tax hike of that kind. Creating real balance, the right balance, means shifting power away from Washington, placing it in the safe hands of the American people. That's what the voters said last year when they gave us shellacking to the big spenders. And that's what we should do now, and that's what I will be working for, and I believe a lot of other people in Congress on both sides of the aisle will be working for. I would thank the chair. Note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Thank you.